both in people and in art. So I'm really glad you could join us. It may not be apparent. You know why you're here to celebrate with Bill and Karen because of Bill's new sculpture and with our artist Larry Nowlan. But the backstory, though, is something that Henry Duffy is going to share with you. And this has been one of those works of art projects that's been in the making for, I don't know, 20 years. And it's this idea of continuity of our cultural heritage, from Augustus St. Gaudens, who you'll hear more about, to Christian Petersen, now to Larry. Larry is with us today, and I want you to reflect that now, when Petersen started, the founding artist for what I think is the Art on Campus collection, he would have never claimed that distinction. But for me, that's who he was. There's now over 500 artists in the collection. So Larry is joining all of those artists that help make up that intellectual and expressive diversity that we now have in the Art on Campus. And it is through the talents of those artists that really add to Iowa State's expressive content. And so, for me, that expressive content is just absolutely the most core value we have at Iowa State. I'm always trying to convince all of you likewise. So I hope that you'll think of that in terms of an accumulation of the last 80 years of what we've been doing. Every journey is fabulous that we go on. And we'd watched Larry's work for quite some time, was thrilled when he said yes. I mean, he was the hardest yes I got to. It must have taken us, I don't know, 15 seconds on the phone.
Maybe the decimal point was 1.5.
1.5. And he'll tell you maybe more about that. And you're going to hear from Larry. But you're also going to hear from Dr. Henry Duffy. And Larry introduced us to Henry, who's graciously come out here with us. Henry is the Augustus St. Gaudens curator at the National Historic Site in Cornish, New Hampshire. And he is the know-all about Augustus St. Gaudens. And he'll have revelations to share with you about St. Gaudens and about Larry, and he will weave that connection. So, Henry, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. I've had a wonderful visit here with Lynette and Nancy and David and Allison and Adrian and everyone else. And I met the Bergans last night, and you have a treasure there. Not so sure about their dog, but they're there. What I wanted to tell you a little bit about today is a little bit of the background of how you get to this kind of a work of art. Let's see. Here we go. And where we're starting this story is with Augustus St. Gaudens, who was in some ways not unlike Petersen. There's an interesting thread to this whole story. When you see him here, he looks like a very rather serious, important kind of a man. And that's because he cultivated that image publicly. But he was, in fact, a poor boy from Dublin, Ireland, born of a French father and an Irish mother, born in 1848. And if you know anything about Irish history, 1848 was not a good year to be born in Ireland. It was the year that the famine began, although that was mainly in the West, not so much in Dublin, it was not a good time to be raising the family in Ireland. So his parents picked up and moved to America like so many other immigrants. And he settled in New York City, and he grew up there, went to art school in Paris and in Rome, came back and created a life for himself. But what's interesting is that he also created an image for himself too. And the image of an artist in his time is different than what we often think of as an artist. In his day, an artist was a public spokesman, a cultural icon. Not the starving artist thing came in the late 1940s, 1950s, came after World War II. in his day, that wasn't it. In his day, the artist was meant to be a social leader. So when he grew up and wanted to create his image, the image that he creates is this image of the established conservative cultural icon. So he's wearing a suit and he's looking very grave and important. And he had in his workshop, in his, as he became established and became popular and became successful, he added more and more people to his circle of workers. And one of them was a photographer, and it was, I don't know of any other artist in his time who had a photographer on the payroll, but he did. And the photographer was, I call him the court photographer because that's what he was. He was the guy who was to take the public image of St. Gaudens and to create the public image of St. Gaudens. Now, St. Gaudens was like everyone else. He was, as I say, he was a poor boy. He struggled his whole life with a sense of inadequacy, feeling that he was uneducated, he was poor, that he should have been, better. But he's not going to show that in his business persona. In his business persona, he's going to show what his assistant John Fraser called a weary lion, a kind of a powerful, a man powerful but at rest, kind of there's a potential to strength there, but that was the image that he created publicly. He's known for Civil War monuments, and this is his greatest, on Boston Common. It's a monument called the Shaw Memorial. If you come to our national park in New Hampshire, you'll see the second bronze version of this. There are only two. We have the second one. This was a monument which happened after the fact. It was dedicated in 1897, long after the Civil War. But it was to commemorate initially the colonel, the man on the horse, Robert Gould Shaw. But his family insisted that the story was about the men and not about the colonel. And the men are not the average unit of the Army, because it was the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, which was the very first African-American unit in the Union Army, in the American Army. And that came about in 1863 as a necessity. The Union in 1863 was losing the war. The Civil War was far more violent and far more difficult than anyone had imagined it would be. And frankly, they were running out of men. They didn't have the soldiers. They were dying too quickly. So they had to find a new body of men. So they realized that they had to go to this untapped group of people. So the first African-American unit was formed. They were freedmen. They were not slaves. They were people who were already free. But they were fighting, and this is what comes back to what I was just saying, and this is the theme that comes through. They were fighting for their people. They were not fighting the same war that the white soldiers were fighting. They were fighting to prove their own worth, their own value. And then you have Shaw, and Shaw is an interesting guy because normally when you hear the story, you hear the heroic story. And he came from wealth. His father was one of the wealthiest men in America. So he had a life of ease. But Shaw was a rather feckless young man. He had gone to Harvard. He wasn't very good at it. He didn't graduate. He tried business, and he was okay, but he wasn't very good. He was essentially drifting. He was essentially living off of his father's money. And then the war came, and he found a place there. And where he really found it was when they gave him the colonelcy of this fledgling experimental unit, regiment. And what this commemorates is the climactic moment, the Battle of Fort Wagner outside of Charleston Harbor. Happened in July of 1863 when the Union threw this massive force up against an entrenched Confederate garrison in this fortress and lost heavily. But Shaw died, and about 300 of his men died. It's about a quarter of his unit that died. But it was their culminating moment. It was his culminating moment. So this becomes then something which is a story of a people struggling, of a young man born to wealth struggling, and about an artist who has to tell this story, who has to have his own epiphany. Because St. Gaudens, like most other people in his time, had zero experience of black people. Didn't know any black people. So when he first started this, to try to tell this story, he started it with the usual kind of stereotypes and prejudices and so on that everybody else in his time had. But so he had to learn. So there's a whole process going on of discovery and creation to come up with something which was described by one contemporary critic as a symphony in bronze, and it is. I mean, there's a lot more to the story, but I don't have time for that today. But it's that kind of discovery that I'm mainly focusing on right now. The other thing that relates to the story is the thing that St. Gaudens discovered in Europe was what's known as low-relief sculpture or bas-relief, half-relief sculpture. What it means is taking a flat surface and building up from it to make what's essentially a sculptured painting. It's essentially a painting done in sculpture. And it's something which is extremely hard to do. And so there are not very many people doing it. And right now, Larry is one of the few who's doing it well. I mean, there are people who do a hack job of it, but it's very difficult to do it well. And you can see the variety that St. Gaudens is doing here, that once he gets the idea of it, then he does more and more with it. So you can do it almost in the round, like this one. She's walking out at us. Or you can do it very, very flat, like that one of Stevenson. And then he did other experiments like this one. This is a wonderful one. Nobody would ever think to do a commissioned portrait from the back, but it works. And the curve of her arm matches the curve of the chair and so on. So all of these things are relating to where we're going here. Maybe. There we are. Some of you are familiar with here, Christian Petersen. Christian Petersen, although he's younger than St. Gaudens, describes St. Gaudens as one of his mentors, as one of the people who really inspired him. And I've had the great joy in the last 2 days of seeing quite a few of Petersen's works. And, you know, we're all familiar with the ones you see on campus, but the ones that are in storage, the ones that are the early pieces, are very much like St. Gaudens. And so much so that, in fact, he has a St. Gaudens. He actually owned a small plaster sculpture relief by St. Gaudens, which he used as a teaching tool to learn how to do that technique on an early portrait he did of a man named Osgood. So there's a direct link from St. Gaudens to Petersen. Petersen changed his style here to the more familiar style, but he began in the same style as St. Gaudens. And you kind of get the sense, when you look at some of the reliefs, you kind of see where that's coming from now. You kind of see that he's getting it from that more traditional classical style that he got from St. Gaudens. But you can see that he's simplifying it, abstracting it. And he got that from Grant Wood, I now know. I didn't know that before I came here, but that's where he got it from. And one of the things that is interesting about this too, and one of the points that St. Gaudens always made about art, when you look at sculpture, most of us are only seeing the surface, but there's more to it than that. And he always made the point that, like anything else, you need to know the math. You need to know what the technique is. You need to know what the structure is in order to make anything work. And no matter how abstracted or how simplified the surface is on Petersen's works, no matter how that goes, and I just saw one of the very last ones, which is almost calligraphic, the one on the Brunnier building, isn't it? Yeah, 1951. That's almost just an ink. It's almost just a drawing. But in order for any of that to work, there's still a structure behind it. You might not see it, but you have to feel it. You have to know it's there. So you have to know that there's a bone structure behind each of these figures in order for it to work. And there's a structure behind this too, even though it looks flat, but there's a structure, and that's important too. But Petersen also, like St. Gaudens, like Shaw, also went through this period of learning and creating a place for himself here. And there's always this sense of an artist being a seer, but being also a tool in a way to allow the rest of us to see something that we haven't seen before. And here's Larry, and I only have one slide of Larry because he's going to tell you his story far better than I would, although my story might be different than the one he would tell. But you can see it's in a similar way. It's an artist creating works of art that have something inside of them. Here's a low relief of Oprah Winfrey. When I showed this the other day, I said, if that looks like Oprah Winfrey, that's good, because that's who it is. Here's the other two. Here are the Harry Callis in Philadelphia. This is a relatively new one. This is one of Larry's earliest ones of Ralph Cramden, the Honeymooners. And this one, this picture I had to put in because it's cute, because this is Larry's little boy, and it's just cute, so I had to put it on there. But it's the same kind of thing. And Larry's, in his story, you're going to hear his story too. It's very similar to what I've just been saying about the different aspects of an artist, of how he gets to where he comes, and how all of that works together with training and everything else to come up with an image that you see in front of you. So, set the stage, and now it's up to Larry. Thank you.
Are we a little technical, or are we going to change over right now? Do a changeover. Larry, come on up.
Evan could probably answer some questions.
If anybody has any questions.
You start to get the sense of what we're doing. We're seeing Petersen, St. Gaudens to Petersen to Larry, and that's our train that we're going through, and Henry did a great job.
Is your St. Gaudens site, park, or whatever you call it, is that open year-round?
Well, it's the St. Gaudens National Historic Site. It's a national park in New Hampshire. It's New Hampshire's only national park. And it is open seasonally. It's open from Memorial Day through the end of October. In northern New England, we just can't be open in the winter. Weather is too nasty. We just can't.
Technically, are we ready to go? Yes.
I think so. All right, my name's Larry Nowlan, and it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here. Iowa has become one of my favorite places on earth. I think that I've gotten over the fact of thinking you're from aliens, that you're aliens, which I've never met. I'm from Philadelphia, but I've never met people like Iowans in my life, the nicest people in the world, so it's really nice to be here. And now, after Henry's intro, I'm starting to think you can see right through my facade here, the suit and the jacket and the image I'm trying to put out there. I'm sure by the end of this you'll have seen right through it, it'll come apart. But anyway, I grew up in Philadelphia, the 6 to 7 kids, right outside of Philadelphia. And although my grandfather, Philip, created Buck Rogers in 1929, there weren't any artists in the family to speak of. And so I didn't grow up in an environment that was very artistic. And so I went to Catholic school through grade 12. And if any of you have gone to Catholic school, I imagine you had a similar experience that I did. That art class was getting a piece of paper and a pencil, and the teacher had an hour break, so you got to draw. And that was about the extent of it. But I spent a lot of time drawing in my copybooks and getting in trouble for it. And as I said to the group the other day, that for 360 days of the year, I'd get detention for drawing in my copybook, and then the week of Christmas would come, and they'd ask me to paint the manger, and you'd be a superstar, and then January would come, and it was back to detention. So it's sort of those mixed messages all through school about artwork. But I could always do it, and I had a couple opportunities in high school to produce things that turned out really nice, I thought, and other people thought so too, but I didn't have any sort of guidance or direction. So I sort of put it down. I went to undergraduate school, a small state school in Pennsylvania, and I was going to major in art, so I took a lot of basic art classes, 100-level classes. And the sculpture department there was more of an open studio. So the first day of class, freshman year, we got a lecture and slideshow by the teacher, and he showed old work that had been done in the class, and we talked about bronze casting. And that was the only lecture I received in that in 4 years. And then you basically went through the process of creating a clay sculpture, a plaster mold, then a wax, and did a lost wax. So after that first project, we did an animal, because they said if you do an animal, people don't see them every day, so if there's mistakes, you know, it'll look better. Like if you do a human, it's probably not going to look too good. You can have a bronze human lying around the rest of your life, it doesn't look too good. So we did an animal. But after that, I cut out the middleman, and I just would bring wax home to my dorm room and make sculptures in wax. And growing up, I was a big sports fan. I played at sports my whole life. Both of my brothers were very good athletes. And the human figure and the power and the emotion in a human figure, that's what sports, that's how I got to sports, I think. I mean, it was covered up by sports, but what was really going on is I just loved the figure. I loved. And all the years that I went to church, I would just stare at the artwork. So I sort of missed a lot of mass, a lot of sermons, but I could probably recreate the Stations of the Cross in the church I grew up in. And it was just very powerful to me, the whole thing. But at this point, all throughout college, I never really had a lecture on sculpture. So I graduated from college, and I took the first job that was offered to me by an advertising agency. And that was the other thing growing up, is my father was a Korean War veteran, and there wasn't much communication. He was a workaholic, and he set an example, and that's the way it was. So in my house, if you had anything, you had a job first. And so the work ethic was there, and the work ethic, and I think the focus in Catholic school and discipline played a part later on. I look back and I can really see that. But at the time, so I took this job, and I worked in an advertising agency, and I started it on the ground level, and I worked my way up. And I guess in about 6 years, they had, I'd gotten up to art director, and at that time everything was turning into computers, and I had never worked on a computer in my life, but I kept telling the bosses they needed to do this, and I would show them images of what we could do, and then one day they called my bluff, and out we went and bought a computer, and that Monday, I was sitting there with a computer. So for the next 2 years of my life, I learned how to use the computer and taught myself all sorts of graphics and whatnot, and did all sorts of stuff with that company. But what I realized was when I came up for air, I was just really not happy. I was working like crazy, and it was sort of an out of body. Like Henry said about being brought up in that environment, you know, I didn't grow up in a place where people were asking me what I wanted to do, really. A big family, it was like you had a job and stuff. So I came to this realization that I was working like crazy, like what was I doing this for? I didn't really have a direction. And at that time, by the grace of God, I came upon a catalog from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And I was flipping through it, and there was a night class in figure sculpture, where they were going to have a model. And it was something I always wanted to do. So I was, I don't know, 27 at the time, I think. So I signed up for the class, and I got the syllabus, and it came with a list of supplies to bring. So I went out and I got the little pack of sculpture tools that you get at the generic art store, and I got, they said to bring a 36-inch armature. Well, that's 3 feet, right? So I walked to the store and I asked, and I said, "Do you have a 36-inch armature?" And these are specialty items. You have to go to specialty stores to get this, but I didn't know. So she said, "No, we have 12-inch armature." So she brings out this little box about the size of an iPad, you know, little box. And I'm like, "Great," so I paid for it. Show up in my first class at the Pennsylvania Academy, the oldest art institution in the country. And I walk in the room, and there are all these easels and armatures. It's like walking into Michelangelo's studio, right? And these things were big. And I had this little box in my thing, and I just like looked over my shoulder like, there is no way I'm pulling that out of my head. So a minute later, thank God, the teacher said, if anybody forgot their armature, we'll build one. And I was like, oh, forgot it, back in the car. So anyway, I took the class, and it was natural to me. The anatomy, in doing a figure, I could see the anatomy. And when the terms came up, it was like learning the names to the roads of the town you grew up on. Like you knew your way around the town, you just didn't know the names. So I could put all that together, and several times during the first and second sculpture we did in the class met maybe once a week, maybe twice a week. You'd do a sculpture for 5 weeks and then do another one. The teacher would go around the room and give individual critiques. And several times he'd be on the other side of the room, and I'd be working, and the model's between us. And then he'd walk right across the room and spin my piece around and go, "Did you see that line there?" And I'd be looking at it like, yeah. But I didn't know the lingo. I didn't know. I mean, these people had been doing this for years. So then he'd walk back. So I'd leave feeling really good, but I really didn't know what I was feeling good about. So this happened several times. And finally, one day after class, he came over and said, "Take a look around the room. These people have been doing this for years. Look at your piece and look at theirs." So for a person who was sort of like out on a limb at this point, you know, that was a pretty powerful statement. But at the same time, again, I'm in a place where I didn't know where to go with it. So I asked him about it. I said, "I would like to go to graduate school, but I don't know like figurative schools." So he mentioned the Pennsylvania Academy where I was, and he mentioned Boston University had a little figurative. But figurative sculpture is not something that's really taught in this country anymore. But a couple weeks later, I was working on those two applications, and then he mentioned this school in New York called the New York Academy of Art Graduate School of Figurative Art. It's the only exclusive graduate school of figurative art in the country. They accept 11 sculptors, 20 painters. And so when I got their catalog, the cover had a Michelangelo drawing on it. It wasn't Michelangelo, it was some teacher or something, but that's what it looked like. It was unbelievable work. So I really killed myself on those other two applications. And all the leftover stuff I sent to New York. And after one of those night classes, I literally wrote the essay out on the essay form in pen. It was 3 sentences long. I have no idea. I still to this day want to go back and see if they have it, because I don't know what I wrote. But fast forward 2 or 3 months, and I don't get into Pennsylvania, I don't get into Boston. And so I call New York just to get it over with. It's like torture. And the secretary answers the phone, she puts me on hold, and a couple minutes later, a fellow answers the phone, and he says, "Congratulations." And I said, "I think you have the wrong line." And he said, "Is this Larry Nowlan?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You got in, congratulations." And I was stunned. So I said, "When do we start?" And he said, "September." I said, "Great, see you then." Hung up the phone. I was stunned. So I left Philadelphia, just at 27, 28, whatever I was. I left and went to New York for graduate school in sculpture. Now all these people that know me say, like, we were like, "What the hell are you doing?" You know, but at the time, I was just going. So I go to New York, and I'm a fish out of water. These people have been in art school their whole life. Long story short, quickly I realized that I just can't communicate like these. They learned a whole way of communicating and acting in art school, and I was getting banged around in Philadelphia. So that wasn't really going to work, but I knew I could outwork them all, and that's what I did. And I just worked like crazy. To me, it was like, I was 28. To be able to go in a sculpture studio at 6 in the morning and stay until 12 at night making sculpture was like a dream come true. So that's what I did. I worked like crazy, and so my first year, I was at school all day, and then I'd come home and send out applications to anything, shows, whatever it was. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was applying to things that there was no chance in the world. But one day I get a call from a fellow named Greg Schwartz from St. Gaudens National Historic Site. And I thought he was going to ask me for a donation. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I was eating apples for lunch. Like, that was it. And so anyway, he said, yeah. And I'm like, St. Gaudens, like, and he said, but yeah, you applied here for the sculptor in residence position. And I was like, oh, yeah. And so he said, I'd like to talk to you. Can I interview you? And I was completely like, I didn't know when, so basically I said like, well, can we do it there? And he said, well, we're closed. We open Memorial Day. And I said, well, you're calling from there now, right? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, I can come up. And he said, well, we've never had that. It's like a national thing. And I said, well, I can come up. And he said, okay. And I said, how about next Wednesday? So I was off the phone, and I had a week, and I'm like, oh my goodness. So the next week I drove up there, and I interviewed in person with Henry's fellow worker, and it went great. And so it was St. Gaudens Estate, and it's a national park now, so it had his studios. And most of the artwork is put away in the winter, but there was this little studio that was like heaven to me. It's about, 8 feet by 10 feet. It's 15 yards into the woods. And so that's where I worked. So I went up there, I won that my first year. When I went back to graduate school the second year, they asked me to come back, and then I won a commission for a national monument. So it was, things were happening fast. And it's humbling to talk about. So here, this is the national monument. So that happened, and it's in March of my second year of graduate school. So you're talking about a year and a half, 2 years after I took that night class. So, so that happened pretty quick. So I left grad school, I went back to St. Gaudens, rented another studio to do the big pieces in, but also worked at St. Gaudens. I spent 3 years at St. Gaudens in a row, and then I went back to help out 2 years later for a couple of years. And in that time, I had the ability not only to study St. Gaudens' work every day, but also to interact with visitors and talk about the art of sculpture and the process of sculpture. And, what was interesting about that was the people you meet, but the other thing was that the job was to talk about St. Gaudens' work and the process, but they would all come in there and say, what are you working on? So, it was interesting to learn how to talk about your own work. And, but at the same time, it was out of body to me because I didn't know, it was instinctual. Most of it was instinctual. I learned a lot in graduate school, but it was still instinctual. And so I was creating things and meeting people, and I met a fellow the 5 days, within the first 5 days I was there was nothing in the studio except me, a bag of clay, and a little relief I had done. And I met this fellow, and we hit it off, and 5 years later, he called me up and asked me, he said, it was sort of like Lynette years later. He said, oh, I got called about this project to do a Jackie Gleason as Ralph Cramden. It's going to go right by Times Square. You think it's something you might be interested in? And I said, yeah, let me think about it for a second. Yeah. And lo and behold, we did that project. But I was involved with him in developing the ESPY Award, and that's another music award we did. This was a fountain that was done for a museum in Cornish. These are low-relief portraits at the Vintners Hall of Fame in St. Helena, California. It's right above Napa Valley. That's one side of the room. There's about 50 of them in there now. And every year they have an induction dinner, and they unveil the previous year's inductees. And this is all just been an organic one thing after another. When I first started, I was talking to the students the other day, when I would have a job, I would be into that job about 30%, and then 70% of me would be so scared about my next job. So I would be focused on chasing these things down, and what would happen is I would go way over the top on proposals, and I wouldn't get it. And I'd be like in pieces on the floor of the studio, and the phone would ring, and 2 hours later, and someone would say, you Larry Nowlan? Yeah, you do sculpture? Someone told us about you. We'd like to talk to you about this piece. So, who are you? And this isn't the piece I really wanted, but I came to start to understand about being in the moment and taking care of business at hand. And so this is the Jackie Gleason on the left. This was actually my MFA project, the middle piece. This is a veteran memorial I did. And so, in listening to Dr. Duffy talk, I was thinking about that process. And in a lot of ways, I'm still in that process. I'm in the process where he spoke about the early work of Christian Petersen work. It resembled St. Gaudens, and then he came to Iowa State and was in his own place for a long time, and it sort of developed into what it became. In a lot of ways, I'm still in that. I came to it so late. On the right's Harry Callis, that's at the baseball stadium in Philadelphia. On the left is a piece I did for the Marine Biological Lab in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Some of you may recognize these. Another interesting story is all that time that stuff was going on, I was still living on about $50 a week. That went on for years, 6 years or so. So one day I went to talk to a fellow who's like a mentor to me, and I'd sent some pieces to a foundry to be cast, small pieces, and so I sent them, but I didn't send them any money. I just sent them. And so they would call every once in a while and say, "Yo, you can send a down payment. We really want to get started on these." And I was scared to death because I had just gotten married, so I might have had $5 grand in the bank. And he said that he was just telling me that like you have to put money back into what you're doing too. So you can't just have like a pond that has one end. There's got to be an in and an out, you know. So I went back to this always gets me, so you're gonna have to bear with me. I went back to my studio and I'm in the driveway and I said like, all right, God, let me know this is the right thing to do because I'm gonna write this check. And, excuse me. I was newly married, so I walked inside I walked in the studio and excuse me, the answering machine was blinking. Sorry. Well, the message was Pamela Trippy, who was the curator for the University of Iowa. And this is hit me hard. But 2 weeks later, I was in the president's box at the University of Iowa Purdue game, talking about the 16-foot Nile kick I was going to be doing. And I also ended up doing a big relief there of Kinnick and several other pieces there. So that was, that was another level. Things moved up. And so since that point, I've done several other pieces. Dane Gable that was done in the spring. That was unveiled. And so again, it's extremely humbling and sort of magic in a way how this is all happening. So lo and behold, these are some of the pieces I'm currently working on. On the upper left-hand corner is a Christ figure, and that's a digital image of a maquette, and that you use as part of the enlarging process. On the right is a picture of the sketch I did of Joe Frazier. I was just commissioned by the city of Philadelphia to do the monument to Joe Frazier. At the bottom is a wildcat in process, which is for an old New England boarding school that is going to be, that's where that's going to go. That's getting cast now. That's when it was in process. And, but several years ago, this gal taking the photo down in the corner called me up, and she told me she was, I'd seen my work and this and that, and she wanted to ask me about a public art project, and so she said, it all depends on you. It's the budget. Can you do a life-size figure of this coach for X amount of money? And I said, no, I can't. I said I could do a 7-foot version of that for that price, but I can't do a life-size piece. And the reason for that is because I don't usually do life-size. I haven't done a life-size piece because if you do a life-size sculpture, it always appears small. Like, it's going to shrink, but your monuments are monuments for a reason. So you've probably seen life-size sculptures on the street, and they look like nice little, small little things. So I always think of Rodin. He's another big inspiration. So that's what we did here. And what you see here is this is a picture taken in my studio, and there's the maquette. It's in the other room. This here is an image. This is a new way that they enlarge sculptures. They'll scan that 3D image. They'll scan that maquette and get a 3D image. And then what they do is they route the figure out of styrofoam. And you route it, instead of building it the old-fashioned way where you put a steel frame in there, build wood on top of that, and clay on top of that, the enlargement would weigh hundreds of pounds. So today, you can get it cut out of styrofoam and put a pole into the back to stabilize that. But you don't enlarge it 100% to the surface. I get it done, like take it back about an inch. So there's an inch of clay I cover it with, and then I resculpt the whole thing. So what you see there is the computer telling you the block of styrofoam and how the machine's going to cut the front and the back out of the enlargement. This is my studio, and this is the enlargement with just the clay being put on, starting to be put on it. Okay, and so here we had some visitors out in Vermont. A great visit by a legend and her husband. It was a great visit and wonderful time. And so this is just the bronze being poured, the raw bronze being worked on in the finished piece over at the Athletic Center. And this is what raw bronze looks like. Well, not raw, it's dirtier than that. This piece here has been sandblasted. So it's cast in sections. So these are all different sections. And after they're cooled and you break them out, you cut the vents off them, you have to weld all the sections together. It's like Humpty Dumpty. That's how a bronze sculpture is hollow and not solid. That when you make the mold's in a bunch of sections, and each section gets cast separately. Then you put them back together and tack weld them into place, and then put a hard seam on all the welds, and then you grind it all down to get one solid hollow figure, and then you sandblast it so the surface is even. So then you can put the patina on it, and the patina is acid. You torch the bronze to heat it up, and then different types of acid turn bronze different colors. So in this case, we did a traditional, most outdoor patinas are brown, which is a traditional because it stays the longest. If you do a blue patina and you put it outside, within 2 years it'll be a black color. White will be a milky, white falls apart, a lot of them fall apart. This is the traditional one. This is one you see for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's called antique French. But it's funny on the Harry Callis sculpture. Harry Callis liked bourbon, so we used to call it Bourbon Barrel Brown. The reliefs we did at the Athletic Center. This is a photo of one of the maquettes that's in the other room on the left. I had those scanned, that's a scanned image, and then I had them cut into the mold pieces. That's 3 pieces of styrofoam that are actually 3 feet wide and 20 inches tall. There, and that's a negative. That softball player's a negative. And into the negative, I had clay slab rollers in the back of that picture. I would roll out huge slabs of clay, lay them on top of that, and force it into the mold. And when I'd let that get to leather hard, and then I'd flip it out of the mold, take it out, separate it, and then re-sculpt the image and the whole face of the piece. So for these relief panels, there were 9 for each one. There's 27 total. And this is where they were fired. I got them fired at, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Simon Pierce Glass. It's a specialty glass company, real high-end. Well, their studio's right up the street, and I'm friends with them. So I brought them in there, and they have huge. This cart is on wheels and rolls straight into the kiln. And then they lock it, and then they roll it out the other side. So that's what you see there. A lot of these panels are on there. And these are the only images I had of the piece before I came. And they're being installed at that point. But, so at this point, that pretty much wraps it up. But the other thing I want to say is one of the greatest things about this job that I have is the people you meet. Like I said, I'm still in that area where it's all just coming together. Still after, I guess I've been doing it for 16 years or so. And I'm still finding my way, and you meet people, and you know, Lynette and the staff here. And Bill and Karen came out and met us and went to the studio, and we had a great time. It's not often that you get, you know, a legend and her husband to come to your studio. And I was gonna submit Karen's name for canon, you know, to be, you know, canonization. But I heard the story about Woody, and after hearing about that story, I'm not sure about that. But Bill, you know, we had a very special moment there that I'm going to tell you about. And he's going to be horrified right now. But, you know, you have a legend come. And, well, maybe I'll just show you the picture. There you go. There's my son here, and that's my daughter. There's Coach Bergan. So, anyway, that's all. Thank you very much.
When you met with Bill and Karen in their home and what you went through or put him through for the sculpting process, and then when you saw the 3 athletes and what happened after that.
Oh, okay. Well, I went to Bill's house and we took measurements. I brought out calipers, and for portraits, you can you draw out measurements: width of eyes, width of nose, length of nose, width of head, height of head, and you list them on a sheet. And then you draw a straight line out, and you take calipers and say, you know, to the zygomatic arch right here, and you measure that distance, and then you lay it down next to that and you mark it. So I went through Bill and took complete measurements of everything for his portrait and whatnot, and photographs. We photographed everything. And as far as the three athletes, when we sat down to talk about Bill's piece, on the plans, they had these 3 brick plinths across from Bill. So I said, we got to put reliefs on those. You know, this is jumping in. So we had gone around earlier and seen the 3 athletes. So we're like, we can do terracotta reliefs and put them right on there. And so that was a natural fit. But what wasn't clear to me was that the 3 athletes had been done by someone who had been working in this medium of terracotta for 20 years. And I got a crash course in terracotta. I did 90 of those panels to get 30 of them. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle. And like I had mentioned, Lynette walked me off the ledge a few times back down. But it was quite a struggle. And you know, and that's when I'm around St. Gaudens' work and I see Christian Petersen's work. A, I realize how much there is to learn, and B, the appreciation for how talented these people were is, you know, if you're not a musician and you hear a song, that's a pretty good song, but if you're a musician and sometimes you know what goes into that, like Henry was talking about, the structure, you have a treasure here in Christian Petersen, I can tell you that. I leave here and I'm just like, wow, I'm never going to make it in this business. And then Lynette says, you can come back anytime, there's a little room down there and you can study his work. And then I just might do that. Anybody else?
I know you continue